Well, welcome everybody. This is Professor Michael Pelias for an introductory lecture and commentary on C. Wright Mills's articulation of the sociological imagination. This work was written in 1959. It was an attempt to set the ground, if you will, for sociological inquiry straight by confronting the dominant moments of the discipline and its tradition. And so Mills is really an original here in this first chapter of the sociological imagination, the promise, which has been assigned to the class. The promise, again, was the promise, what the sociological imagination can do. Its promise is, generally speaking, about engaging a social totality, the totality of our involvements in everyday life, and being able to work through both history and its objective, quote unquote, conditions, right? And understanding our biographies, our lived experience vis-a-vis that history. So in some ways, Mills opens up the question of the self and society, the self and history, and what role does this play? And he's very interesting in beginning of the essay, the promise, in talking about how alienated and trapped we are. That we are really basically trapped and alienated in our own, subjectivism, if you will. We only think of our self-interest. How do we pay the bills, etc. We don't really go beyond to understand our place in the world, our place in the society itself, and engaging this. He talks about older ways of thinking and feeling have collapsed, and new beginnings are very difficult to absorb. And he's really looking for this new beginning through the sociological imagination. How do we begin to, again, enable the possessor of the imagination, its promise, to understand the larger historical context in terms of the meaning for our inner lives, right, and the external, career or events that an individual faces in his life. So the sociological imagination, in terms of its enabling function, allows us to take into account how we ourselves, in the welter of daily experience, become falsely conscious of our social positions. We become kind of embedded in what other people have called ideology, the lived reality of imaginary conditions rather than the actual real conditions, right? So in that moment, the framework of modern society is sought and the psychologies are formulated. Unfortunately, right, this hoists upon us a kind of a bad methodology, a bad way of understanding ourselves. So the first idea of the imagination, its fruit that it bears, is that social science in social science is the idea that we can understand our experience and articulate our fate only by locating ourselves within a period in which we live. So we could talk about, we live in the age of the digitalization. We live in an age of, new technological formations which dominate us in everyday life, the reign, if you will, of cybernetics. And how do we experience this? How do we place ourselves in our history? And how do we make the most of it? Right? So anyway, you can only become aware of who you are in your circumstances, and that again is a model of the history. Very, very important to remember that you're living out a biography. So the sociological imagination is really always trying to perform the task of grasping history and biography and the relationships between the two within the general framework of the society or the social, if you will. Again, the social totality incorporates both our personal biographies and the history in which we're experiencing and a grasping of that history. Mills mentions many of the greats in the history of sociology, including Thorstein Veblen, his great book, The Theory of the Leisure Class. Of course, Karl Marx, in terms of his studies, Max Weber, Auguste Comte, the French positivist in Layers of Society, and Karl Mannheim, among others. So again, he's looking at this, the classical social analyst does this, such as these people, and he mentions this in the beginning of the promise. So anyway, anyway, to avoid, right, making mistakes, social science must go back to biography, history, and the intersection to really understand the intellectual journey. And we get three basic sorts of questions that we are going to address in the sociological imagination. What is the structure of the particular society of a whole? Right? We have spoken about the role of sports in society and the shaping of society. How do we do a sociology of sports based on this sociological imagination and its promise? Well, we have to look at the structure. What are the components? How are things related to another? Owner-player relationships, the spectacle. Many things we're going to engage during the semester. The fan versus the spectator. What ultimately is a political athlete? All of these are feeding, in a way, these new components of looking at a particular structure of society and how we are going to historicize that. And in that vein, we will be engaging Dave Zirin's great way of doing sports history differently, doing history differently, in a book called The People's History of Sports in the USA. Okay, then where is this society located in the general scheme of human history? How do we really talk about it? What is its place, its meaning in human history? Are we living in a nihilistic area? Are we living in an era of despair and misery? Or are we living in a very optimistic time? Or a mixture of the two? So we want to really examine these affects to which we have been subjected in this moment. And then finally, what types of men and women, prevail in this kind of society and period, and what kinds of human nature can be revealed? Not that human nature is static or fixed. It is a part of history. It is a part of our lived experience, in a way, how we react. And you're really looking here in Mills's sociological imagination, an idea that affects are really important to study, the affect of a society and in that moment. So this is very, very important to look at these three sorts of questions that will be arising throughout our semester, right? So anyway, then he goes on to a term called milieu. And this is, in the second section of the promise, what is between the personal troubles of a milieu and then the public issues? How does one live in a certain environment? And then what are actually the public issues of the social structure? So in a way, it is not essentially just an individual problem, healthcare, if you will, or an individual problem that one is jobless. It's a societal problem, etc. So this is very important to remember. Yeah. So this milieu-based theory is very important, and he goes on to considering unemployment, war, and marriage as examples of this milieu. And I will speak more to this in the class, right? And what is caused by structural changes. So there is this shift to structure in the sociological imagination, in the promise, what the structure is and what it does. Etc. So this is very important to remember as well as we go forward. So we have the history, right, and lived experience, the collapse of values, etc. How do we reorient it? And then the task and the promise of the sociological imagination, which again is in section 2 of the promise. What is its tasks and its problem? And we'll be going through this all throughout the semester. What are antagonisms, right? What are their crises and institutional arrangements? Again, going back to the sociology of sport, we just don't look at the game. We look at the game in relationship to the society. To what does NFL football play to in us? What affect does it produce? What does it engage us in? So this is very important to remember. What does basketball do to us? How do we relate to these games? Again, how do we look at this comprehensively? You might want to look at, a signifier, if you will, a meaning around a term such as the Golden State Warriors. One wants to study, when you begin the Golden State Warriors, why does it capture the imagination of so many people in the world? Why does it begin to become a brand? How does it become a brand as a basketball team? What are the relationships between ownership, upper management, general manager, coaches, and players? What kind of chemistry is being developed? All of these things, as well as who are the players, what is the outcome of the game? So again, we're going to be looking at this in terms of the general society, of course, right? And then the commodification of sports, how that may take away from our lived experience. And this opens up the possibility of the distinctions between fan and spectator. So in the next lecture, we will talk more about some of these distinctions that the sociological imagination allows us to take into account. Again, we're going to be looking comprehensively at totalities here. Okay, thank you very much, and there'll be another uploading soon. Okay, thank you.